My name is Jonathan Chu. My dad is Chinese. My mom is Indian. We have a restaurant, Wing Kwong restaurant, where we basically make fusion food. Well, my grandparents are from China. My dad was actually born in Trinidad, and then he moved to Barbados when he was 6 years old. His father is from the Guangdong area. My grandmother, she's from the Hong Kong. She has family in Hong Kong. It was interesting. Obviously, there's a small Asian population in Barbados, so being anything other than black, you're already a minority, and then being a minority within the minority was really unique. Well, I wouldn't say it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just that's the experience that we had. Our family being half Chinese, half Indian, you weren't just one thing. If anything, we were Asian, but we weren't wholly Chinese, we weren't wholly Indian. And the great part about that is because you're a part of two different people, but we were a thing on our own. Being Asian in Barbados is also, I say it's different because we didn't really have any rules to go by. We weren't specific to one community, so what was great about our family is that we adopted a very Caribbean way of life. It didn't have to be Indian, it didn't have to be Chinese. We were just Caribbean people, even if we didn't look like Caribbean people. Well, my mom, being Caribbean Indian and from Trinidad, there's a big Trinidadian population that's Indian, so she definitely taught us, what she's accustomed to, her way of life. My dad, again, being Chinese, that was the difference because there was no frame of reference for us. There were no other Chinese kids running around that we can play with and be like, oh, that's how we do things. So the way that he grew up, our family being the only Chinese family that we knew of growing up, he would tell us things that he learned from his father, our grandfather, and that was the connection. Essentially, it was a lot of passed down things because even we had CBC, so it's not like if there was a bunch of Chinese movies on TV all the time, you wouldn't have that frame of reference of media. We didn't have the internet, so it's not to say that you can just Google China and be like, hey, what pops up? The most that you have is our family and whatever came out of that, our aunts and uncles, whatever stories they would tell us. And since that was our experience, at least I didn't realize how different it was until afterwards. It was like, oh, this is how our family does things. These are the things that we eat. Until other people went over by someone else's house and was like, yeah, we don't eat that food. I didn't know that fried rice and chow mein was different. I just thought, yeah, that's what we eat. Curry is normal. Because Caribbean food is a melting pot of foods. So there's African, there's European, there's Indian, especially depending on which island you come from. The mix is a little bit different wherever you go. Having an Indian mother who cooks Caribbean curries and pilau, and then a Chinese father who makes beef and broccoli and congee and bao and stuff like that. It opened my eyes to the different types of food that you can have. And again, I didn't realize that was different until I started hanging out with other people. And in our house, we didn't eat a lot of pork. Finding out that other people eat pork so regularly, putting in sauce. The wonderful thing about it is that there was because everything was a little bit weird that I ate. I didn't have any restrictions I wouldn't eat that because it's too odd, because it was strange, because I already ate really strange things. Rice porridge isn't a very common thing in Barbados, but we were aware of it, we knew about it, and it was always a really comforting food. So my sister, she got a scholarship when she was very young, about 16, and she moved to the US for a while. She lived in Baltimore, and then she did medical school in Trinidad, and then she moved back to Barbados. she's always been a homebody. She's a complete Caribbean girl, so she loves to run back to Barbados as soon as possible. I, on the other hand, I did my first degree at UE, and after that, I went to culinary school in New York. Then I did a master's in Switzerland, and since then, I've been working abroad for a little while. I'm back in Barbados now, but before I worked on cruise ships, worked some time in Thailand. They actually met, well, before they found out about each other. They didn't meet yet. My aunt was visiting Barbados. My dad lived in Barbados. My mom still lived in Trinidad. My dad picked up the phone, and my mother was calling for my aunt, and he heard her voice, and they started talking. And he fell in love with her voice. So then they actually started dating while my mom was in Barbados. And then she moved back, and they kept on talking. And then she eventually moved over for him. The Caribbean is a melting pot. So in Trinidad, it's normal for, Asians to meet and whatever. In Barbados, it was a little bit different because, you grew up in Barbados, you kind of assume that you would date and marry a Barbadian. It wasn't a problem in any way, but I think, if anything, they were just like, oh, you found a Trini girl, as opposed to just finding someone local. Well, the great thing about New York is that New York itself is a melting pot, but it's a melting pot on a much larger scale because there are different people coming from all over the place who choose to be in the city, as opposed to the melting pot that the Caribbean is. It was sort of forced migration, and that mixing happened years ago, long before our time. So it's kind of weird dealing with the mixing of people as opposed to people coming and mixing on their own. New York, I didn't feel, the biggest thing about it is because me being half Chinese and half Indian, I don't look specifically Chinese or Indian. I look a little bit Mexican, sometimes I look Filipino, like, I find it depending on the person's context, that's what they assume my race is. My friends who are Filipino, their background, although they come from the Philippines, is very Spanish. So I looked more Filipino than he looked, so the teachers would come up to him and they'd be like, they just assumed that he was another white guy or European, and then they would come up to me and then they would be like, oh, you're Filipino, I love the Philippines. I'm like, yeah, I'm from the Caribbean. And they would just be completely thrown off because I'm not what you would think of when you think of a Caribbean person. And there being other Black people in our class, they would expect them to be Caribbean, and a couple of them actually had Caribbean heritage. They were from Dominican Republic and a couple of other islands, but their family lived in New York now, so they consider themselves from the Bronx or Brooklyn, as opposed to me, who's actually Caribbean, and no one's gonna look at me and be like, oh yeah, that's the Caribbean kid. That being said, my experience in Switzerland, the school that I went to, the demographic actually was very Asian. So I'd say about 70% of the kids there were Asian, and that was the first time I had extended experience with other Asians. And what was cool about that was there were mainland Chinese, there were some kids from Hong Kong, there were some kids from Taiwan, a couple Japanese, and of course Europeans all over. So everybody was from all over the place. I had one friend who was from Dominican Republic as well, and all of us got together. Being in that situation though, it was interesting because since it was 70% Asians, they would always hang out together because they spoke Mandarin and they would all hang out. And the rest of us were kind of like, well, we don't speak Mandarin, what are we going to do? So we hung out together, and from that group, because they're Italians and whatnot, it was a lot of English, but there was also Spanish going on. And that was a really interesting melting pot again. Initially, I did think, oh, I should hang out with the other Chinese kids. But again, I don't look traditionally Chinese. So when I met all of them, they kind of like assumed that maybe I was Mexican because there was a lot of Mexicans as well. Maybe I was Mexican, or maybe I was Spanish or something else. It's only, and especially when I talk as well, you wouldn't expect me to be Chinese. The only time that was a little bit weird is because there's always culture shock. A lot of these kids, they never, because me as a post-grad, I still hung out with a lot of the undergrads, and they'd never been away from home before, and they're kind of adjusting to being there, knowing that they didn't really know how to interact with people of other cultures, because, I mean, unless you're brought up in a space where there's a lot of different cultures, you don't really know how to interact with people from other places. So a lot of the Chinese kids, I can't blame them because they never talked to Europeans, they never talked to anyone from outside of China before. So that they were a little bit scared, to be honest. The Europeans and the Mexicans, the kids from Dominican Republic, they had traveled a little bit more. So they were kind of accustomed to like dealing with people from other cultures. But even then, they didn't know how to, because they'd mix with other cultures, but they never mixed with so many Asians at one time. And I thought it was easy. It was easy for me because I grew up in that background. I grew up with a Chinese dad, so I knew like their little quirks and the way that they eat and slurping was always a big deal, because whenever we had noodles, they would slurp everything, and then the Europeans would be like, why are they slurping, like if it was a big deal, and it wasn't. That's just the way that they eat, and they're like, it's so rude, they're like slurping everything, and they're always making all these noises when they talk. And I was like, yeah, this is the way that they eat. And even the group of friends that I was with, sometimes they would talk about the Asians, and I would be like, you guys know that I'm Asian, right? Like, that's a thing. And then they were like, oh, yeah, but you're different. And it's funny because I am different, but that doesn't mean, one, that I don't identify, and two, that just because it's not obvious to them, like, doesn't mean that it wasn't obvious to me that they were just being like kind of mean to them because they were different, because they weren't accustomed to it. So again, going to that kind of school, everybody is from a different nationality, so everyone was getting to know each other. And again, because of my background, I was accustomed to navigating different social groups and different cultures simultaneously. So my friends were getting to know an Asian man, a Caribbean man who's living in Europe. So it was a lot of mixing. While I wasn't the only, so in the group that I was in, it's not to say that there were no Asians who hung out with us. There were a couple. It's just that the point of views were different. So when I'm talking to my Italian friend, like the big topic of discussion was always like, how do you do things? So it would be like, oh, when you go out drinking, what do you usually do? When we all went out and had a good time, right? It was, some of us really like to dance, some of us really like to drink, some of us like to just sit down and talk. And everybody was figuring out like, what do you do? What does your culture like to do, right? And the cool part about that, for me at least, was I was getting to know a lot of people, and they were getting to know my side of things. So as a Caribbean person, like, we like to get up and dance and sing and whatnot, and a lot of the other Caribbean kids, they like to do that too. The African kids as well, like when we would go on the dance floor, I remember my Kenyan friend, she like saw me dancing and she's like, you know how to dance? And I don't think that I know how to dance. It's just that in comparison to the other Asian kids, I looked like if I knew how to dance, but not really. So that was a lot of fun. When we would talk to each other and they would talk about the Asian kids, or they would be like, I don't understand why they do that. It wasn't necessarily a platform, but I would definitely be like, oh, you got to remember that like they do things differently. Like, that's how they eat. When you're eating with chopsticks. You put the bowl close to your mouth so you can like scrape the food in your mouth. And they didn't offer a lot of chopsticks at our school, so they're eating knife and forks, but they would still eat the same way. They would still try to get a bowl, and they would still take rice and they would scrape it into their mouths. And it's just a different culture. That's how each person does things.